I was never meant to know what it feels like to be prey. Not in this manner, not as something to be savored. The Emperor forged the Imperium so mankind would never again cower beneath the predatory gaze of Xenos. So we would stand tall and proud as masters of the void. Yet here I am, guardsman Orin Vale of the Armageddon, 17th alone on the jungle moon of Valor 9, learning precisely what our ancestors knew when they stared into the darkness between the stars and found hungry eyes staring back. The first sign was the silence, not the absence of sound. The jungle never truly falls silent. Rather, it was the sudden organization of sound, the purposeful quality it took, like the difference between the random patter of rain and the deliberate footsteps of something vast approaching. Even the constant drip of moisture from the broad jungle leaves seemed to fall in rhythm. The buzzing insects ceased their endless drone, not at once, but in coordinated waves moving outward from some central point. The small creatures that had skewered through the underbrush now moved with unmistakable intent, fleeing not in panic, but in orderly streams away from whatever approached. Before I saw a single Tyranid, the jungle itself betrayed their presence. It moved differently, it breathed differently, it looked differently. I remember Captain Deshan explaining it during the deployment briefing. How Tyranid vanguard organisms infiltrate weeks or months before the main hive fleet arrives. How they seed the biosphere with microscopic spores that begin rewriting the genetic code of local flora and fauna. How they establish a network of psychically resonant nodes that map the planet and catalog its resources. By the time the fleet arrives in orbit, the world is already half digested. What he failed to mention is what it feels like to realize you are walking through the stomach of a vast patient predator that has already begun to dissolve you. My regiment had been stationed on Valor 9 for standard garrison duty. The moon is, or rather was, a verdant agri-world supplying the Forge world Hellist Prime with organic compounds necessary for certain specialized manufacturing processes. The climate on Valor 9 is ideal for the cultivation of these compounds, with its dense jungle canopy and humid atmosphere. But the moon also sits at the edge of the Odawasa Gap, a region of space recently troubled by reports of unknown contacts slipping through the Imperial Navy picket lines. We arrived 3 weeks ago aboard the transport vessel Crown of Thorns, a lumbering beast of a ship with enough hold space to transport 2 full regiments and their equipment. The Armageddon 17th is not a prestigious regiment. We are not stormtroopers or grenadiers or any other elite formation. We are simple line infantry drawn from the hive world of Armageddon and shipped to whatever corner of the Imperium requires warm bodies capable of carrying a lasgun and following orders. The Monum bureaucrats classified Valor 9 as a low-risk assignment. The moon had not seen conflict in over 3 centuries. Our duties mainly consisted of patrolling the perimeter of the agri-compounds, escorting harvest shipments to the landing fields, and occasionally hunting down predatory fauna that threatened the laborers. The most excitement we had experienced was when a pack of something the locals called ghost claws attacked an outlying processing facility. They were hardly more than feline scavengers, easily dispatched with a few well-placed lasbolts. The complacency was absolute and fatal. When the Vox channels first began crackling with static 5 days ago, tech priest Adept Sorvian attributed it to solar flare activity from the local star. When the astropathic relay went silent 2 days later, it was blamed on warp turbulence. When 3 of our outlying guard posts failed to report in yesterday, Captain Deshan finally ordered a patrol to investigate. I was part of that patrol. 10 men led by Sergeant Thale, a veteran of the Cephagum pacification, with a distinctive scar running from his left eye to the corner of his mouth. He claimed a rebel cultist had given it to him with a poisoned blade, though when drunk he would sometimes admit it was the result of a bar fight in his youth. He was not a brilliant man, but he was competent and steady. Exactly the kind of non-commissioned officer the Imperial Guard relies upon to maintain discipline and execute orders. We departed the main compound at dawn, traveling in a chimera transport along the gravel track that connected the primary agri-facility to the 3 outlying harvester stations. The jungle pressed close on either side of the track, its emerald canopy filtering the early morning sunlight into a sickly green glow. The air inside the Chimera was stifling despite the environmental systems laboring at full capacity. Condensation beaded on the interior walls, and our fatigues were soaked with sweat before we had traveled more than a few kilometers. Kiev, our Vox operator, continued to report only static on all frequencies. Sergeant Thale ordered him to maintain regular attempts at contact, broadcasting our call sign and position at 5-minute intervals. The static seemed to pulse with a rhythm that set my teeth on edge, though none of the others commented on it. Later, I would understand the significance of this, but at the time, I dismissed it as nerves. We reached the first outpost after approximately 1 hour of travel. Even from a distance, it was clear something was wrong. The prefabricated structure of the guard post appeared intact, but the perimeter illuminator arrays were dark despite the gloomy conditions beneath the canopy. The defense turret mounted on the roof was offline, its barrel pointed uselessly at the ground. Most telling of all, no guard challenged our approach. Sergeant Thale ordered the driver to halt the Chimera 50 Meller from the outpost. Standard procedure would have been to disembark and approach on foot in a defensive formation, but the must have sensed the wrongness of the situation. He ordered the gunner to scan the area with the pintle-mounted heavy bolter while he attempted to raise any survivors on the Vox. The Vox returned only that strange, pulsing static. I remember how the frowned, the scar on his face pulling tight against his skin. He was not a man given to hesitation, but something about the situation troubled him deeply. Finally, he ordered Trooper Dellin to man the heavy bolter while the rest of us would advance on foot. We disembarked from the rear hatch, las guns at the ready, and formed a skirmish line as we had drilled countless times. The took point with Corporal Jessen on his right flank and me on his left. The other men spread out behind us, covering our advance with overlapping fields of fire. We moved forward slowly, each step deliberate, eyes scanning the dense foliage for any sign of movement. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Even the omnipresent insects had fallen silent. The only sounds were our boots on the gravel path and the gentle drip of moisture from the leaves overhead. We reached the outpost without incident and signaled for Trooper Renault to check the entrance. Renault was young, barely a year out of basic training, but he moved with the confidence of youth as he approached the door. He reported it was unlocked, which violated standing orders. All outposts were to be sealed when not actively receiving traffic. He ordered Renault and Trooper Marsden to secure the interior while the rest of us maintained a perimeter. The 2 men disappeared inside, and for 30 seconds there was silence. Then Renault's voice came over the squad, Vox tight with controlled fear. "Sergeant, you need to see this." He ordered me and Corporal Jessen to accompany him inside while the others maintained watch. The interior of the outpost was dim, the only illumination coming from emergency. Illuminator strips casting a dull red glow over the scene. The main power was out, though the backup generator should have activated automatically. The reason it had not became immediately apparent. The generator housing had been torn open, its internal components shredded as if by enormous claws. But it was not this that had prompted Renault's call. The 4 guardsmen who had been stationed at the outpost were still present in a manner of speaking. Their remains were distributed throughout the main room in a pattern that defied natural predation or conventional warfare. It was methodical, analytical. Each man had been dissected with precision, their component parts arranged in what appeared to be order of biological complexity. Skin, muscle, organs, bones, each separated and laid out as if for some grotesque anatomical study. Their expressions, where faces remained intact, showed they had been alive during the initial stages of this process. Most disturbing of all was the complete absence of blood. Not a single drop stained the floor or walls. Whatever had done this had harvested every bodily fluid with perfect efficiency. Even the air lacked the expected stench of death, replaced instead by a cloying sweet odor like overripe fruit. Sergeant Thale crossed himself with the sign of the Aquilor and muttered a prayer to the Emperor. Jessin, a veteran of 15 years, emptied his stomach in the corner. Renault stood frozen, his young face pale in the red emergency lighting. Marsden was already backing toward the door, his las gun clutched so tightly his knuckles showed white. I remember thinking with strange clarity, this is not the work of rebels or pirates or any human agency. The clinical nature of the dismemberment spoke of something utterly alien in its thinking, something that viewed humans not as enemies to be killed or even as meat to be consumed, but as specimens to be catalogued. And then I noticed something else, something that sent ice through my veins despite the tropical heat. The body parts were not static in their arrangement. They were moving subtly, almost imperceptibly, contracting and expanding as if still trying to draw breath. And from them, thin tendrils of some translucent substance extended outward, connecting the separated parts in a grotesque parody of the human nervous system. Before I could alert the others, the Vox unit on Tyle's belt crackled to life. Through the static came Trooper Dellen's voice from the Chimera, high and tight with panic. Movement in the trees. Multiple contacts closing fast. Emperor's blood. They're coming from all sides. They barbarked an order for immediate withdrawal. We rushed from the outpost into the murky green light of the jungle. What I saw there will haunt me for whatever brief remainder of life I am permitted. The Chimera was surrounded by flowing shadows that darted between the trees with terrible purpose. Not the random movement of animals, but the coordinated advance of organisms, acting with a single mind. Shapes low to the ground with too many limbs. Airborne forms darting between branches, larger silhouettes moving with deliberate slowness at the periphery of our vision. Delsin fired the heavy bolter in controlled bursts, the weapon's distinctive boom echoing through the jungle. I saw one of the smaller creatures explode in a spray of chitin and ichor as a bolt round found its mark. But for every one that fell, 3 more appeared from the undergrowth. We ran for the Chimera, firing as we went. Lust beams cut through the humid air, occasionally connecting with the Xenos. Where they hit, carapace blackened and bubbled, but the creatures showed no reaction to pain, continuing their advance without hesitation, even when grievously wounded. Trooper Marsden never made it to the transport. Something erupted from the ground beneath him, a mass of claws and fangs that engulfed his lower body in an instant. He managed one piercing scream before he was dragged beneath the surface, the disturbed earth settling back into place as if he had never existed. The rest of us reached the Chimera and piled through the rear hatch. They was the last aboard, firing his last gun on full auto into the advancing horde until the power cell depleted. He slammed the hatch closed just as something heavy impacted against it, leaving a dent in the reinforced metal. "Drive!" The bellowed at the operator, and the Chimera lurched forward, crushing several of the smaller creatures beneath its tracks. The transport's hull resonated with the impacts of claws and bodies as the Xenos hurled themselves at the moving vehicle. Kiv was frantically trying to raise the main compound on the Vox, but received only that same rhythmic static. They ordered him to switch to emergency frequencies and broadcast a general alert. The Chimera accelerated along the track, but the jungle itself seemed to be working against our escape. Branches and vines whipped at the vision blocks, reducing visibility to near zero. Twice the driver had to swerve to avoid fallen trees that had not been there on our journey out. I heard it first, a faint scratching from above. I looked up just as something began cutting through the roof of the transport. A serrated limb, like a grotesque fusion of blade and insect appendage, pierced the metal with contemptuous ease, slicing through it as a man might cut parchment. The tip of the limb missed Renault's head by centime, then withdrew, only to plunge down again in a different location. They shouted for us to concentrate fire on the roof breaches. We directed our last guns upward and fired until the interior of the Chimera was filled with the acrid smell of ozone and scorched metal. The attacks from above ceased momentarily, but by then a new threat had emerged. The driver screamed as something struck the forward vision block with enough force to crack the armored glass. Through the spider web of fractures, I caught a glimpse of a creature clinging to the front of the vehicle. It had too many eyes, all of which seemed to focus on the terrified man with cold intelligence. Then the vision block shattered completely, and the creature was inside the compartment. It moved with blinding speed, its limbs a blur as they seized the driver. I caught only an impression of cheating and claws before the man was pulled through the opening, his scream cut short by the sound of tearing flesh. The Chimera veered sharply without its operator, crashing through the undergrowth before slamming into a massive tree trunk. The impact threw us against our restraint harnesses, and I heard Jess's arms snap with a sound like a dry branch breaking. For a moment, there was silence, except for the hissing of the damaged engine and the groans of injured men. Then the attack resumed with renewed intensity. The hull of the Chimera rang with impacts from all sides. The roof began to peel open under the assault of those terrible blade limbs. Through the shattered forward compartment, I could see more of the creatures gathering their alien forms, moving with that same terrible coordination. Out everyone out the rear hatch. The ordered, grab whatever weapons and supplies you can carry. Form a defensive circle once clear. We had no choice but to abandon the protection of the transport. They hit the emergency release for the rear hatch, and we spilled out into the jungle, firing blindly in all directions. I remember the humid air hitting my face, thick with the scent of decay and that strange, sweet odor I had noticed in the outpost. Somehow, we managed to form a rough circle, our backs to one another, as Thala had ordered. 8 of us remained. Marsden was gone. The driver was gone. Jess clutched his broken arm to his chest, his las gun held awkwardly in his offhand. The Xenos had withdrawn into the jungle, though we could hear them moving around us, rustling through the undergrowth just beyond the limit of visibility. Occasionally, I would catch a glimpse of movement, a flash of kitten between the trees, but never enough for a clean shot. Kiv's status on the Vox, the demanded, his voice steady despite our desperate situation. Still nothing but static, Sergeant Kiv replied. But there's something else now. A pattern in the interference almost like words, but not in any language I recognize. Keep trying, ordered. The rest of you, conserve ammunition. Fire only when you have a clear target. We need to move toward the main compound. Stay tight. Watch your sectors. We began to move through the jungle in formation, each man responsible for covering a 30-degree arc around our perimeter. The going was slow, the undergrowth dense, and seemingly designed to impede our progress. More than once, I found my boots entangled in vines that seemed to writhe with deliberate purpose, requiring me to cut myself free with my combat knife. The Xenos shadowed us, always just out of clear sight. Occasionally, one would dart forward, drawing fire from our increasingly nervous group before melting back into the jungle. Each time, we expended precious ammunition for no result. I began to suspect this was their intention all along, to drain our resources before the main assault. We had been moving for perhaps 20 minutes when Trooper Hull, a quiet man from the underhive of Armageddon, cried out in pain. We turned to see him clawing at his face, blood streaming from his eyes and nose. "Get it out!" he screamed. "Emperor, save me!" I can feel it moving inside my head. Before any of us could react, Hal raised his las gun to his temple and fired. The back of his skull erupted in a spray of bone and brain matter, his body collapsing to the jungle floor. In the sudden silence that followed, I thought I heard something like distant laughter from the surrounding trees. They ordered us to keep moving, but fear had taken firm hold now. 7 of us remained, and the certainty that we were not escaping this jungle alive began to settle in my gut like a cold stone. The attack, when it finally came, was not the frontal assault we had been bracing for. Instead, the ground beneath our feet suddenly shifted, becoming soft and yielding like quicksand. We began to sink, the earth itself seeming to digest us. Panic broke our formation as each man fought to find solid ground. In the chaos that followed, I lost track of my squad mates. Flashes of last fire illuminated the jungle in staccato bursts. Screams echoed from multiple directions. I fired my own weapon blindly, more to create light than with any hope of hitting the enemy. I managed to pull myself onto firmer ground, my boots finding purchase on what felt like a tangle of roots. I heard Sergeant Tyle shouting orders somewhere to my left, his voice still commanding despite the terror evident in its pitch. "Form up! Form up on me for the Emperor!" I moved toward his voice, but before I could reach him, a sound cut through the cacophony of battle, freezing my blood. It was a scream, but not of pain or fear. It was the scream of a man whose mind has shattered completely, whose very soul is being consumed. I recognized it as Thal's voice, though nothing in his 15 years of service had ever broken his composure. The scream lasted for what seemed an eternity, modulating in ways no human throat should be capable of, before ending in a wet, gurgling sound. I ran. Emperor, forgive my cowardice, but I ran. Not toward the or any of my squad mates, but away from that terrible sound. Through the undergrowth I crashed, heedless of the noise I made or the direction I traveled. My only thought was to put distance between myself and whatever had reduced Sergeant Tale to that final terrible scream. How long I ran, I cannot say. Time lost meaning in the green twilight of the jungle. Eventually, physical exhaustion forced me to stop. I collapsed against the trunk of a massive tree, my chest heaving as I gulped the humid air. As my breathing slowed and my pulse steadied, I became aware of the silence that had fallen. No insects buzzed, no creatures called, even the constant drip of moisture from the canopy had ceased. The jungle was holding its breath, waiting. I took stock of my situation. My las gun remained, though the power cell indicator showed less than 20% charge remaining. My combat knife was secure in its sheath. I had 3 ration packs, a canteen half full of water, and a handful of spare power cells in my webbing. My Vox bead was still in place, though it emitted only that same rhythmic static when I attempted to use it. Most importantly, I had my wits. The initial panic had subsided, replaced by a cold, calculating part of my mind that recognized survival would require discipline and intelligence. I forced myself to recall the tactical briefings we had received regarding Tyranid organisms. Knowledge is a weapon, perhaps the only one that might avail me now. The creatures hunting us were almost certainly genus dealers or some variant thereof. Vanguard organisms sent ahead of the main hive fleet to infiltrate and map the targeted biosphere. They would be gathering information on indigenous life forms, including humans, cataloging strengths and weaknesses for the Hive Mind to analyze. They would also be establishing synaptic nodes throughout the jungle, psychic relay points that would later guide the main invasion force. I remembered the sweet smell I had noticed at the outpost and in the jungle. Spores, most likely changing the chemical composition of the atmosphere in preparation for the arrival of the fleet. The strange movement of local fauna, the coordinated withdrawal of insects, all of it pointed to a biosphere already being rewritten at the molecular level. This meant the main fleet could not be far away. Days, perhaps, rather than weeks. And it meant that even if I somehow managed to survive the vanguard organisms, the moon itself would soon become uninhabitable for human life. My only hope was to reach the main compound and somehow get off-world before the Hive fleet arrived in force. A faint hope at best, but the only one available to me. I oriented myself using the position of the sun, visible through gaps in the canopy. The main compound lay to the northeast of my position, perhaps 15 kilometers as the crow flies, on foot through dense jungle, avoiding Tyranid patrols. It would be a journey of at least 2 days. I set out at a cautious pace, moving as quietly as possible through the undergrowth. Each step was placed with deliberate care to avoid creating noise. Each breath was measured and controlled. I became not a man, but a ghost, drifting through the jungle with the singular purpose of survival. As darkness began to fall, I searched for a defensible position to wait out the night. A hollow at the base of a massive tree offered some shelter, its opening small enough to defend with my knife should anything discover me. I crawled inside, using fallen foliage to partially obscure the entrance, and settled in for a night of watchful waiting. Sleep would be dangerous, but I knew I needed rest to maintain my faculties. I decided to allow myself brief periods of shallow sleep, no more than 15 minutes at a time, keeping my knife in hand and my last gun across my lap. Before closing my eyes for the first time, I offered a silent prayer to the Emperor, asking not for deliverance, which seemed beyond even his divine reach, but for the strength to face my death with dignity when it inevitably came. The night passed in a series of fitful dozes, punctuated by moments of heart-stopping terror at every sound from the jungle. Twice I heard movement outside my hiding place, a soft, kittenous scraping that might have been caused by the passage of one of the smaller Tyranid forms. Each time I gripped my knife tighter and prepared for discovery, but each time the sound moved on without investigating my shelter. Dawn brought no comfort, merely exchanging the terrors of darkness for the visible horrors of day. As light filtered through the canopy, I carefully emerged from my hiding place and continued my journey northeast, moving from cover to cover with paranoid vigilance. It was mid-morning when I found the first body. Not one of my squad mates, but a worker from one of the agri-facilities. He hung suspended between two trees, held in place by strands of some biological webbing. His chest had been opened with surgical precision. His internal organs removed, yet somehow he still lived. His eyes tracked my movement as I approached, silently pleading for the mercy of death. I whispered an act of contrition as I pressed my las gun to his temple and ended his suffering with a single shot. The sound of the discharge seemed deafening in the quiet jungle, and I immediately regretted the mercy, knowing it might have given away my position. I moved away from the site quickly, but the image of those pleading eyes stayed with me. I wondered if the worker had been left there deliberately as bait to draw out survivors like myself. The thought that the Xenos might be using such tactics suggested a level of cunning that turned my blood cold. As the day progressed, I found more bodies. Some were guardsmen, others civilian workers. All showed signs of Tyranid experimentation. All had been kept alive despite grievous injuries. All had been positioned along likely escape routes from the outlying facilities toward the main compound. They were hearing survivors, channeling them along predetermined paths, studying their reactions, learning. I began to deviate from the direct route to the compound, making my way through the densest sections of jungle where movement was most difficult. If the Tyranids had established kill zones along the obvious paths, my only chance was to avoid those paths entirely. The going became painfully slow. Vines and thorns tore at my uniform and skin. The humid air made each breath a struggle. Insects, either immune to or ignored by the Tyranid spores, plagued me constantly. But I pressed on, driven by the primal urge to survive just one more hour, one more day. It was late afternoon when I heard it. A human voice calling for help. Weak, pained, but unmistakably human. It came from a clearing ahead, beyond a screen of dense foliage. Every instinct warned me it was a trap. The Tyranids had demonstrated their ability to manipulate human remains, to keep tissue alive long after it should have expired. What better lure for human prey than the sound of a comrade in distress? Yet, I could not simply ignore it. If there was even the slightest chance that another survivor needed aid, my duty as a guardsman compelled me to investigate. I approached with extreme caution, using the cover of the undergrowth to observe the clearing before revealing myself. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. Corporal Jessen lay in the center of the clearing, his broken arm now a twisted mass of flesh fused with something alien. Tendrils of pale biological matter extended from his body, anchoring him to the ground. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, and his lips moved continuously, forming the words, "Help me, over and over, though his eyes stared sightlessly at the canopy above. Surrounding the clearing, partially concealed among the trees, were Tyranid forms. I counted at least 6 distinct organisms, each perfectly motionless, waiting. This was indeed a trap with Jess as the bait. I should have retreated immediately. The tactically sound decision would have been to circle around this position and continue toward the compound by another route. But something held me there, watching a terrible fascination with the methodology of the Xenos. They were not simply hunting, not merely killing for food or territory. They were conducting an experiment with Jessen as both subject and researcher. The tendrils connecting him to the ground pulsed with a regular rhythm, and I realized they were collecting data. His fear, his pain, his desperate hope for rescue. All of it was being transmitted to the Hive Mind for analysis. The Tyranids were not just learning about human physiology, but about human psychology, about how we think, how we feel, how we respond to stimuli. They were learning how to break us most efficiently. I knew then that I could not leave Jess to this fate, not even if it meant my own death. I took careful aim with my lasgun and fired a single shot through his forehead, granting him the only mercy left within my power to give. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Tyranid forms around the clearing exploded into motion, converging on Jess's body with frightening speed. I did not stay to observe what followed. I ran, changing direction frequently, using every technique I had learned in basic training to break a pursuit. I heard them behind me, crashing through the undergrowth with little attempt at stealth now that their trap had been sprung. They were fast, far faster than a human could hope to match over distance. My only advantage was my knowledge of human tactics and the unpredictability of desperate fear. I doubled back on my trail, crossed a shallow stream to mask my scent, and finally took refuge in the hollow trunk of a fallen tree, pulling foliage over the opening and lying perfectly still as the sounds of pursuit passed by on either side. For hours, I remained there, not daring to move, even as cramps seized my muscles and insects crawled across my exposed skin. Darkness fell once more, but I did not emerge from my hiding place. The Tyranids would expect me to move under cover of night. I would wait until dawn when they might believe I had already passed beyond this area. The night was a torment of physical discomfort and psychological strain. Every sound from the jungle outside seemed magnified. The darkness inside the log was absolute, pressing against my eyes until I began to see phantom shapes moving in the blackness. The sweet scent of Tyranid spores grew stronger, seeping through the rotting wood of my shelter to fill my lungs with each breath. I thought of my home, the steel and concrete hive city on Armageddon, where I had been born. I had joined the Guard to escape that place, to see something of the wider Imperium, before inevitably returning to take up my father's trade as a manufacturing worker. How strange that I now longed for those cramped chab blocks and polluted corridors. At least there the dangers were human ones, comprehensible in their motives and limited in their methods. When dawn finally came, I was stiff and aching, but alive. I carefully emerged from my hiding place, scanning the jungle for any sign of Tyranid presence. Seeing nothing immediate, I resumed my journey toward the compound, moving with renewed caution. The jungle had changed noticeably overnight. The vegetation seemed more uniform, less diverse in its species. Patches of some pale, fleshy growth had appeared on tree trunks and across the forest floor. The air was thicker with spores, giving the light filtering through the canopy a strange, diffuse quality. I covered my mouth and nose with a strip of cloth torn from my uniform, though I knew it would do little to protect against microscopic spores. I had almost certainly been infected already, but perhaps I could slow the process long enough to reach the compound. My path took me along a ridge overlooking a shallow valley. From this vantage point, I could see for some distance across the jungle canopy. What I saw stole the breath from my lungs. Vast organic structures rose from the jungle at regular intervals, some already reaching hundreds of meters into the sky. They pulsed with life, expanding and contracting like the chambers of a heart. Between them stretched membranous tissue that connected each structure to its neighbors, forming a vast network across the landscape. Capillary towers, the first major Tyranid constructs established on a victim world. They would accelerate the process of atmospheric change while also serving as psychic amplifiers to strengthen the synaptic network across the surface. Their presence confirmed my worst fears. The main Hive fleet had arrived in the system. Valar 9 was already lost. The question now was whether any Imperial forces remained to attempt an evacuation, or if the moon had been written off as a casualty of war. I continued toward the compound with renewed urgency, no longer moving with such extreme caution. Speed now took precedence over stealth. If evacuation was still possible, it would not remain so for long. Once the fleet began its primary landing operations, the jungle grew stranger with each passing kilometer. Familiar plants had been replaced by alien vegetation that moved with apparent consciousness. The ground beneath my feet felt less like soil and more like flesh, yielding slightly with each step before firming again. The air shimmered with spores so thick they were visible to the naked eye, drifting in complex patterns that seemed to respond to my presence. I was moving through a landscape being actively transformed into a Tyranid breeding ground. Soon nothing recognizably terrestrial would remain. It was midday when I crested a final ridge and saw the main compound in the valley below, or rather what remained of it. The perimeter walls had been breached in multiple locations. The main structures were partially collapsed. No signs of human activity were visible, no weapons fire or movement at defensive positions. But the compound was not deserted. Far from it. Tyranid organisms swarmed across the ruins. Creatures of all sizes, from tiny worker forms to massive warrior beasts. At the center of the compound, where the command building had once stood, a massive organic structure pulsed with malevolent life. It resembled nothing so much as a gigantic brain exposed to the air and throbbing with activity. A synaptic node, a psychic relay for the Hive Mind coordinating the activities of all Tyranid organisms in the region. Its presence explained how the vanguard forms had operated with such perfect coordination during our initial encounter. I watched from concealment as a landing craft descended from the clouds. Not the clean lines of Imperial design, but the organic horror of a Tyranid vessel. It settled in a cleared area near the compound, disgorging hundreds of warrior organisms that immediately dispersed into the surrounding jungle with clear purpose. The invasion was proceeding exactly as planned. Valoran X would be stripped of all useful biomass, its atmosphere rendered toxic to human life, its resources consumed to produce more Tyranid organisms for the next world in the Hive fleet path. And I was witnessing it all, helpless to intervene, barely able to comprehend the scale of the assault. One man against a living galaxy of perfectly coordinated killers. The reality of my situation descended upon me with crushing weight. There would be no escape, no rescue, no last-minute extraction by Imperial forces. I was already dead. My body simply had not yet received the information. That realization should have broken me. Perhaps it did in some fundamental way, but it also brought a strange clarity. If death was certain, then fear became irrelevant. All that remained was to choose the manner of my ending. I could continue hiding, surviving day to day until the spores inevitably corrupted my body from within. I could take my own life, denying the Xenos the satisfaction of my capture, or I could strike one final blow against the enemy, however futile it might be in the grand scheme of the invasion. The synaptic node drew my gaze like a lodestone. If it was indeed the coordinating center for the local Tyranid forces, damaging it might create momentary confusion among the lesser organisms. Not victory, not salvation, but perhaps a small act of defiance to remind the Hive Mind that mankind does not yield without cost. I took stock of my remaining equipment. The las gun with its nearly depleted power cell. My combat knife still sharp enough for one final task. 2 frag grenades I had scavenged from the kit of a fallen comrade during my flight through the jungle. Not much, but perhaps enough. I spent the remainder of the day observing the compound, noting patrol patterns, and identifying potential approach routes. The Tyranids maintained a perimeter, but it was not designed to keep intruders out, rather to catch fleeing survivors. Their attention was focused outward, not inward, a fatal flaw in their strategy that I might exploit. As darkness fell, I began my approach, moving from shadow to shadow, using the ruins of collapsed buildings for cover. The altered terrain worked to my advantage now, the fleshy growths absorbing sound and masking my heat signature from the sensitive organs of the hunter forms. I avoided direct contact with the patrolling organisms, freezing in place when they passed near my position. Twice I was nearly discovered, saved only by the intervention of random chance as larger creatures diverted the attention of my would-be discoverers. It took 3 hours to traverse the 500 from the perimeter to the central structure. The synaptic node pulsed before me, its surface rippling with electrical activity that cast an eerie blue light across the surrounding area. Up close, I could see it was not simply a massive brain, as I had first thought, but a complex fusion of biological components harvested from multiple species, human among them. Faces I recognized from my regiment were partially visible within the mass, expressions frozen in eternal agony. A wave of revulsion swept through me, nearly overwhelming my resolve. This was abomination beyond comprehension, the ultimate perversion of life itself. The hive mind did not merely kill its victims, it incorporated them, repurposing their very essence to further its insatiable hunger. I slipped behind a section of fallen wall approximately 20 malers from the node. From this position, I could see the entire structure while remaining concealed from patrolling organisms. I removed my 2 grenades from my webbing and considered my options. The grenades alone would damage the node, but likely not destroy it completely. I needed a way to amplify their effect to ensure maximum destruction with my limited resources. The answer came as I observed a group of smaller organisms approaching the node. They carried something between them, a pulsating sac filled with luminescent fluid. They attached this sac to the surface of the node, where it was gradually absorbed into the larger mass. Nutrients, perhaps, or genetic information harvested from the local ecosystem. Whatever its purpose, it represented a vulnerability. If I could detonate my grenades at the precise moment such a sac was being integrated, the resulting chemical reaction might cascade throughout the node. I waited, conserving my strength and controlling my breathing. As the hours passed, more nutrient sacs were delivered at irregular intervals. I studied the process, noting that the smaller organisms retreated a safe distance during the absorption phase, suggesting the process generated some form of energy or radiation, potentially harmful even to Tyranid forms. Near dawn, my patience was rewarded. A larger convoy approached, bearing not 1 but 3 of the pulsating sacs. These were different from the others, glowing with a more intense light and causing visible excitement among the attendant organisms. This would be my opportunity. I readied my grenades, removing the pins, but keeping the levers depressed. I would need to time my attack perfectly, reaching the node at the exact moment the sacs were attached, but before they were fully absorbed. I offered one final prayer to the Emperor, not for salvation, but for the strength to complete my task. Then I moved. The 20 malers between my hiding place and the node seemed to stretch into infinity as I sprinted forward. I was halfway there before the nearest Tyranid forms registered my presence, their sensory organs swiving toward the unexpected movement. They were fast, but I had a surprise and a desperate purpose on my side. I reached the node seconds before the warriors could intercept me. The nutrient sacs were already attached, beginning to sink into the pulsating mass. I slammed both grenades into the nearest sac and released the levers. The detonation timers began their brief countdown as I turned to face my pursuers. The first warrior reached me, its claws slashing through the air where my head had been a moment before. I ducked beneath the blow and drove my combat knife up into the joint where the limb met the thorax. Ichor sprayed across my face, burning like acid where it touched exposed skin. A second warrior circled to my flank, its movements more cautious after witnessing the fate of its broodmate. I feinted left, then lunged right, but the creature anticipated my movement. Its tail whipped around, catching me across the chest and sending me sprawling to the ground. I tasted blood in my mouth as I rolled to avoid a killing blow from its claws. My ribs were broken, each breath sending shards of pain through my chest. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was buying a few more precious seconds. The warrior loomed over me, its eyeless head tilting as if curious about the small, fragile creature that had dared to challenge the might of the Hive Mind. Behind it, I could see more forms converging on our position, drawn by the psychic alarm broadcast by the node. "For the Emperor," I whispered through bloody lips. The grenades detonated. The world went white, then black. I felt myself lifted and thrown through the air by the force of the explosion. Something sharp pierced my side, pinning me in place as debris rained down around my position. Through a haze of pain and disorientation, I watched the synaptic node convulse violently. The nutrient sacs had indeed amplified the effect of the grenades, creating a biochemical reaction that spread throughout the structure. Sections of the node blackened and withered, while others burst open, spewing noxious fluids that seemed to consume whatever they touched. The effect on the surrounding Tyranid organisms was immediate and dramatic. The lesser forms collapsed instantly, their connection to the controlling intelligence severed. Larger warriors staggered and flailed, reduced to their base instincts without the guiding presence of the Hive Mind. For precious seconds, chaos reigned in the compound. Tyranid fought Tyranid, unable to distinguish friend from foe without the synaptic control of the node. The perfect coordination that made them so lethal had become, briefly, their greatest weakness. I laughed through the pain, a wet bubbling sound that brought more blood to my lips. I had done it. One insignificant human had struck a blow against the Great Devourer. The damage would be temporary, the setback minor in the context of the overall invasion, but I had proven that even the Hive Mind was not infallible. My moment of victory was short-lived. Already I could see larger Tyranid forms moving with purpose toward the damaged node. These must be synapse creatures, organisms with an independent connection to the Hive Mind, capable of re-establishing control over the swarm. Within minutes, perhaps seconds, order would return to the alien ranks. I tried to move, but found my body unresponsive. The piece of debris that had impaled me, now visible as a shard of Catan from a warrior form caught in the explosion, had severed my spine. I was paralyzed from the chest down, trapped in place to witness whatever came next. What came next was something I had not anticipated. A shadow fell across me, blotting out the rising Sunday. I looked up into the compound eyes of a creature far larger and more terrible than any I had yet encountered. A Tyranid prime, or something similar. A command organism of significant rank within the Hive Mind hierarchy. It regarded me with alien intelligence, its head tilting this way and that as it processed the scene. Then, to my horror, it reached down, not to kill me, but to carefully lift my broken body from the ground. I tried to resist, to reach for my knife, but my arms refused to obey. The creature held me with surprising gentleness, like a collector handling a rare specimen, which I realized with mounting dread was exactly what I had become. The prime carried me away from the damaged node through the milling ranks of confused warrior forms that parted before their superior. I was brought to another structure I had not noticed during my reconnaissance, a smaller growth that pulsed with the same sickly blue luminescence as the node. Only when I was placed upon its yielding surface did I understand its purpose. It was an examination chamber, a place where captured specimens were studied in detail before their genetic material and biological uniqueness were harvested for incorporation into the hive. The surface beneath me shifted, tendrils rising to secure my limbs and torso. I felt a sharp pain as something pierced the base of my skull, then a cold sensation spreading through my brain. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords no longer responded to my commands. I remained conscious, however, terribly, mercilessly conscious as the examination began. The Prime loomed over me, its compound eyes reflecting my broken form. Behind it, other specialized organisms gathered, each adapted for specific analysis functions. One extended a limb that terminated in something resembling a surgical instrument, though formed of bone and chitin rather than metal. My flesh parted beneath its touch, but I felt no pain. The connection to my brain had suppressed those signals while maintaining my awareness. I watched with detached horror as the creatures methodically dissected portions of my body, examining each with that same clinical curiosity I had observed at the outpost. But this was different, more thorough, more purposeful. I was not simply being taken apart for study. I was being scanned at the genetic level. My entire biological existence cataloged and evaluated for useful traits that might be incorporated into the hive. And something else was happening, something far worse than physical dissection. I could feel a presence in my mind, sifting through my memories, my knowledge, my emotions. The hive mind itself accesses my consciousness through the neural connection established by the examination chamber. It was teaching me, not just my body, but myself. Everything that made me human was being absorbed, analyzed, understood in ways I could never comprehend. The sensation was one of utter violation, more intimate and terrible than any physical torture. I tried to resist, to hide certain memories or thoughts, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with my bare hands. The presence swept through my mind with unstoppable force, consuming everything in its path. In those moments, I gained a terrible insight into the nature of the Tyranid hive mind. It was not simply hungry for biomass, not merely seeking to consume. It was curious. It wanted to understand what it devoured to incorporate not just genetic material, but knowledge, experience, culture, to absorb not just the flesh of a species, but its essence. And through that neural connection, for just a moment, I glimpsed something of the vastness of the hive mind itself. An intelligence so alien, so incomprehensibly vast, that my sanity began to crumble at its edges. I saw the fleet moving through the void between stars, world after world falling before its relentless advance. I saw variations of the invasion process adapted to countless different biospheres and defending species. I saw the endless cycle of consumption and growth that had proceeded for millennia, and would continue until the galaxy itself was stripped bare of all life save the Tyranid. The vision mercifully faded as the connection weakened. The examination was complete. I had been catalogued, my genetic material and knowledge harvested for the benefit of the hive. I was no longer of interest as a living specimen, one of the smaller organisms approached with a limb modified into a blade of impossible sharpness. My death at least would be quick and efficient. But before the killing blow could fall, the chamber shuddered violently. A new sound penetrated the organic walls, a sound so familiar and yet so unexpected that for a moment I thought my mind had finally broken completely. The distinctive crack of bolt weapon fire, the roar of assault cannons, the earth-shaking impact of drop pods slamming into the ground at terminal velocity. Space Marines. The Angels of Death had arrived on Valar 9. The Tyranid organisms reacted instantly, abandoning their examination to rush toward the new threat. The Prime lingered a moment longer, its alien gaze fixed on me with what almost seemed like regret at an interrupted experiment. Then it too was gone, leaving me bound to the examination table, surrounded by the discarded parts of my own body. I should have felt elation, hope for rescue and survival, but I knew better. The Space Marines had not come to save survivors. They had come to deny the Tyranid resources of Valar 9. Standard Imperial doctrine for dealing with a hive fleet invasion was clear. Exterminatus was the only certain solution. Through the walls of the chamber, I could hear the battle raging. Bolt of fire, Alien shrieks, the distinctive sound of chains tearing through Khitan. The Space Marines would be advancing in standard formation, clearing the compound section by section, not to hold ground, but to reach key strategic locations. They would be placing charges at geothermal weak points, melter bombs at tectonic fault lines, virus bombs in the upper atmosphere. The details would depend on which chapter had responded and what resources they had brought. But the end result would be the same. Valor 9 would be rendered uninhabitable, transformed into a lifeless rock drifting through the void. Better than allowing its biomass to fuel the next stage of the Tyranid advance. I closed my eyes at peace with this end. My body was already ruined beyond recovery. My mind was violated by the alien presence. Death by fire or virus or tectonic collapse would be a mercy compared to the fate the Tyranid had planned for me. I felt the tendrils restraining me loosen their grip as the structure around me began to collapse. The neural connection withdrew from my skull with a sensation like ice water flowing through my brain. The Hive Mind was redistributing its resources, concentrating on the defense against the Space Marine assault. I found I could move my arms again, though my lower body remained paralyzed. With tremendous effort, I dragged myself from the examination table, falling to the floor in a heap of broken flesh and spilled blood. The organic floor beneath me pulsed with agitation, the entire structure quivering in sympathetic rhythm with the combat outside. Through gaps in the walls, I caught glimpses of ceramite armor in midnight blue. The Night Lords were a traitor legion, servants of chaos who had turned against the Emperor during the Horus heresy. What were they doing engaging Tyranid forces on an imperial world? Then understanding dawned. Not Night Lords, Raven Guards. Their armor blackened for night operations, making them appear darker than their usual deep purple. One of the first founding legions, inheritors of the Primarch Corvus Corax, masters of stealth warfare and surgical strikes. They were not here for a direct confrontation with the full might of the Hive fleet. This was a precision operation, targeting the synaptic control structures to disrupt the Tyranid advance long enough for Imperial Navy assets to establish a quarantine perimeter around the system. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten. It was not truly an answer, but it told me everything I needed to know. I was likely the sole survivor of the Armageddon 17th, and only by virtue of having fled the initial engagement. Shame threatened to overwhelm me until I remembered Sergeant Thal's final order to run and warn the compound. I had failed in that mission, but not through lack of courage. "The invasion," I whispered. "Can it be stopped?" The chaplain shook his head slightly. "This is a tendril of Hive Fleet Kraken, probing Imperial defenses in this sector. We have disabled its synaptic control structures on this moon, but the main fleet continues its advance on other fronts. The battle for this system has just begun." "Will you evacuate?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "The civilian population has been extracted," the chaplain said, "along with essential personnel and equipment. The moon itself must be denied to the Tyranid. Nothing that can fuel their advance can remain." I nodded weakly, accepting the inevitable. "Then grant me a clean death, my lord. Let me join my regiment with honor." The chaplain regarded me silently for a moment. Then he did something unexpected. He removed his skull helm, revealing a face as pale as marble, crisscrossed with ritual scars, and dominated by eyes as black as the void. The face of a transhuman warrior who had seen countless battlefields across centuries of service. "Your duty is not yet complete, guardsman," he said. "You have witnessed the enemy's methods firsthand. You have seen how they study us, adapt to us, learn from us. This knowledge must be conveyed to Imperial command." The apothecary spoke up, his voice concerned. "Brother Chaplain, his injuries are extensive. The infection has begun its work. Standard protocols dictate termination to prevent biomantic contamination. The chaplain never took his eyes from mine. There are exceptions to every protocol. Brother Apothecary, Prepare a stasis field. We will bring this one with us." I wanted to protest, to insist that I had made peace with my death and did not fear it. But the apothecary was already administering another injection, and darkness was closing in around the edges of my vision. The last thing I saw before consciousness fled was the chaplain replacing his helm once again, becoming the skull-faced angel of death that had devastated the Tyranid forces with such terrible efficiency. "Rest now, guardsman or veil." His voice came to me as if from a great distance. "Your fight is over, but your service continues. I write this account from the Medicaid deck of the Raven Guard strike cruiser Shadow of Deliverance as it breaks orbit around the dying moon of Valar 9. Through the viewport, I can see the first stages of the purge already beginning. Precision strikes against the largest Tyranid structures designed to trigger a cascading bioacid reaction that will consume the infestation, and much of the moon is surface with it. The apothecary has done what he can for my physical injuries, though I will never walk again. The damage to my spine is beyond even their remarkable medical technology to repair. More concerning is the infection that has taken hold in my system. The Tyranid spores I inhaled during my time in the jungle have begun to alter my cellular structure in subtle ways. I am being taken to a quarantine facility where I will spend the remainder of my life. My blood and tissue will be regularly sampled, my dreams and thoughts recorded and analyzed for any sign of psychic contamination from my brief connection to the Hive Mind. Every detail of my experience will be extracted and studied by Ordo Xenos inquisitors seeking insights into Tyranid adaptation strategies. In truth, I am still a specimen being dissected. Only now it is my own species doing the cutting. I do not resent this fate. I understand the necessity. The knowledge I carry is too valuable to lose, too dangerous to ignore. And there is comfort in knowing that my suffering might contribute in some small way to the broader Imperial war effort against the Great Devourer. But in the quiet hours when the medic servitors have finished their rounds and the ship's systems have dimmed for night cycle, I find my thoughts returning to the jungle, to the pattern of rainfall on broad leaves, to the coordinated movement of insects and small creatures, to the sweet scent of alien spores that even now work their changes within my body. And sometimes, at the very edge of consciousness, I imagine I can still feel the presence I encountered in the examination chamber, vast and patient and curious, watching, learning, adapting. This, I believe, is what it truly means to be hunted by the Tyranid. Not merely to be pursued and killed and consumed, but to be understood down to the cellular level, down to the firing of individual neurons that comprise your thoughts and fears and hopes. To have everything that makes you human cataloged and repurposed to make the hunter more efficient at killing those like you is a violation more profound than death. It is the ultimate predation. The consumption not just of flesh, but of essence. And it continues long after the physical hunt has ended, in the silence between heartbeats, in the darkness behind closed eyelids. I am Guardsman Oren Vale, last survivor of the Armageddon 17th. And though I escaped the jungle, though I was rescued by the angels of death themselves, I know a fundamental truth that haunts my dreams. The hunt never truly ends. The Tyranid are patient. They can afford to be. They have devoured worlds beyond counting, species beyond reckoning. They will continue long after I am dust, long after those who read this account have followed me into the grave. And they are learning. Always learning. Every encounter, every battle, every small victory we claim against them only serves to refine their methods, to sharpen their hunger, to make them more lethal when next we meet. So remember this, you who stand against the shadow of the Hive fleets. The Tyranid do not hate you. They do not fear you. They do not even truly see you as an enemy. They see you as a puzzle to be solved, a resource to be processed, a set of biological and psychological patterns to be understood and countered with perfect efficiency. And they are very, very good at solving puzzles. The God Emperor protects us all, for against such hunger even his light may someday dim.